As we mentioned in the previous video, the land annexation of the Roman Empire led to fierce competition within the agricultural industry. The yeoman lost in this war, but there was no eternal champion. The slave manor also faced a series of crises after the price of slaves soared in the middle of the 2nd century. Slaves were no longer an inexpensive option for the Roman world at the time, they were now expensive and inefficient. But if slaves are not used, then Roman society can only rely on the labor force composed of free people, so that the economic status of the farmers will be improved. But as far back as the Republic, the reforms of the Gracchi brothers attempted to put an end to this situation, but obviously he had no strength to oppose the Roman aristocrats and slave owners who were in absolute economic dominance, so his reforms ended in disastrous failure. This reminds me of a saying, take a person's wallet, it is better to kill him directly. Obviously, it is impossible to improve the status of the yeoman, which will have a huge impact on the current political structure of the empire. Whether they are nobles or the army, they are all beneficiaries who own a large amount of land. How could they swing the knife of reform at themselves? Therefore, the slave manor must continue to exist in another form or be reformed. For the slave owners in Rome, the continued practice of slavery was clearly not feasible. Therefore in Rome, the colonus as a group quickly grew up. They were the predecessors of the serfs. Colonus were first formed in the 2nd century BC, when Roman citizens were the main components of colonus. In the 3rd century, colonus were not scarce. A large number of bankrupt freemen, freed slaves, and barbarian immigrants were all excellent sources of colonus. They were better and cheaper than increasingly expensive slaves. Unlike slaves, colonus usually have their own families and private property, but they have to pay rent, taxes and labor to the big landowners. They are fixed on the land and can be sold together with the land. But the biggest difference from slaves is that colonus have consumption power, which makes them possible to form a market. After the reform of the once highly concentrated slavery manor into a colonus manor, it is actually a market with a considerable volume, especially for those slaves manors with thousands or even tens of thousands of slaves. The colonus manor they formed were not much smaller than the size of towns. This also means one thing, that is, the former slave master, now the manor owner, can sell products to the colonus without having to sell the products to the city, and the bazaar in the manor of the colonus can meet their consumption needs, and they no longer need to enter the city. Soon, colonus manor became a good place for many homeless civilians and freed slaves, and the scale of these estates became larger and larger. Looks like everyone's happy, doesn't it? Slaves were treated better, homeless people have land to cultivate, manor owners get more profits and have a stable market, and it also provides many services that originally only existed in the city, such as public security, protection, public buildings, etc. But in the process, cities are the losers of the game. A large number of products that should have been imported into the city were consumed by the manor itself, and the city lost its cheap food and raw materials, and its attractiveness declined rapidly. The shrinkage of trade has also brought serious consequences. The former commercial tax is now gradually shrinking. Cities were no longer able to support enough people, so large numbers of urban populations also fled to the countryside. For cities, in the 1 centuries when imperial slaves were cheap, bankrupt Roman citizens could enter the army and enter cities to develop industry and commerce. Food based on cheap labor can ensure their food and clothing. However, cities in the middle and late 3rd century had neither cheap food and raw materials, nor prosperous trade, and there was no reason to retain the bottom population. The policy of the empire also showed this change. In the Edict of Antoninus, promulgated by Emperor Caracalla in 212, all freemen in the Roman Empire were given the status of Roman citizens. This process seems to be a privilege, but it is actually a helpless move against shrinking tax revenues. The main purpose of this policy was to increase the income of inheritance tax. But it was the early 3rd century, and the closed manor economy had not yet taken an absolute advantage, but the shrinking of the city has already begun, and the direct manifestation is the reduction of commercial taxes. At the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian's taxation for rural areas was further enhanced, and at the same time he issued several policies to strengthen the status of agriculture, because the shrunken cities could no longer support the huge expenditures of the empire. They were replaced by the prosperous development of country estates. A large number of manors lost their economic connection with the city, and the city declined rapidly as a result. The cause of the decline of Roman cities in the middle of the 3rd century was not only the strengthening of local markets. These economically powerful landowners gradually began to master their own armed forces. They began to fend off the interference of the central government more and more frequently. Previously, Roman tax collectors were only dealing with scattered peasants, which made it easy for them to carry out extortion. But when these bankrupt peasants were attached to nobles or even officers, Roman tax officials were likely to face thugs, or even an army armed to the teeth, which greatly increased the difficulty of tax collection. From here on, the empire is practically dying economically. The brief prosperity created by previous military conquests is fading. Cities are declining, manor are rising. The former slave master became the lord of the separatist side. The central authority of the empire was emptied. However, Rome did not do nothing, quietly waiting for his death, but made many changes. In the next video, we will explain how the Roman Empire changed these situations, and what these reforms finally had effect.